Hi everybody, so we're going to pick up where we left off with the last few bits of the reproduction lecture, and I think it'll fall into two short videos or so. So taking up where we left off, we were talking last time about the placenta, the different kinds of placentas in eutherian mammals and metatherian mammals, the different embryonic membrane layers, and so on. So we're going to move forward now in time to after the birth of offspring and discuss lactation. And as you know, lactation is a diagnostic characteristic of mammals. The reptilian ancestors of mammals, we don't know whether they lactated or not because mammary glands don't fossilize. So the evolution of lactation is still an open question. There's a lot of speculation as to when lactation might have evolved. We know it was early in the evolution of mammals because all mammals have mammary glands and nurse their young with milk, but we don't know when precisely it evolved, certainly before the placenta and live birth evolved, because the monotremes lay eggs, but they also nourish their offspring with milk from mammary glands. So one of the prevailing thoughts now is that lactation may have evolved in the reptilian ancestors of mammals as a way of changing when resources were allocated to eggs. So you know that within the egg is the developing embryo surrounded by a bunch of membranes, and there's also yolk within a yolk sac, and that yolk serves as a source of nourishment and building blocks for creating the newly hatched organism. So in most species that lay eggs, all the nutrition that's necessary for that newly hatched organism is contained within that yolk. But the kinds of eggs that are laid by reptiles and by the early mammals are parchment eggs, and they have the ability for moisture to move across the eggshell. So they're not completely self-contained. There's evaporation occurring, so there's some loss of liquid, and so it's possible for moisture to move within the eggs, through the shell, through the membranes, and perhaps also for other substances, nutrients, to be able to move across that eggshell and serve as a source of nutrition for the developing embryo. And that's the prevailing thought for how lactation might have evolved. We know mammary glands are like skin glands. They produce secretions, and in the case of the early mammals or mammal-like reptiles that were laying eggs, those skin secretions could have diffused across the eggshell and be used as a source of nutrition for the developing embryos. And from there, once it served as a source of nutrition for embryos while they were in the eggshell, once those embryos hatched, then the offspring could also make use of that skin secretion as a source of nutrition. So that's a pretty well-respected scientist's take on what happened, how this characteristic could have evolved. So now let's look at exactly what the events are in modern day mammals that allow lactation to happen. And there's 2 points in time that we have to look. One is during pregnancy, and then again after offspring are born. So early on, there's a lot that happens to prepare the mammary gland for being functional. Oops, I'm going to have to move. Let's see, it doesn't quite fit. Hang on a second. All right, so it wasn't fitting on the screen. I had to resize stuff, so hopefully you can see it now. This is a little schematic of what's going on endocrinologically that occurs during pregnancy that prepares the mammary gland for producing milk. And we're looking at 3 structures that produce hormones and are the target tissues for hormones. So we have the ovary here, we have the pituitary gland in the brain, and then we have the mammary gland. And so let's start with the ovary here. So during pregnancy, there are very, very high levels of 2 hormones in particular that affect lactation. One is estrogen and one is progesterone. And in some of these diagrams, you'll see estrogen depicted by the letter E and progesterone depicted by the letter P. And the plus sign means that the levels are very high and they also have a positive influence on the target tissue. So estrogen and progesterone are going to be produced by the ovary, and the target tissue here is the pituitary. And the pituitary gland, in response to that increase in estrogen and progesterone, is going to produce a whole bunch of another hormone called growth hormone, so sometimes abbreviated GRH. And the target tissue for that is the mammary gland. The effect of the growth hormone is to increase the size of the mammary gland, the tissue within the mammary gland. So the more tissue there that is able to produce milk, the more milk can be produced by the gland as a whole. Stepping back to the ovary, those same hormones that it's producing that the pituitary is receiving are also being received by the mammary gland directly. So there are receptors within the mammary gland that are reacting to the presence of estrogen and progesterone. And so the hormones also have a direct positive effect on the mammary gland, causing an increase in the amount of tissue within the mammary gland and the structure of the tissue in preparation for making milk. So during this whole time before birth, milk is not being produced. It's just the mammary gland increasing in size, increasing in readiness to produce milk. But after the offspring are born, the hormones change somewhat. So again, hang on just a second. All right, so now it should be the right size for you to see it. So after birth, we have the same three organs. So we have the ovary here, the pituitary, the mammary gland. And one of the things that happens right after birth, sometimes right before birth, within a day or so of birth, is that the ovary stops producing large quantities of estrogen and progesterone. So what that means is that things change in the target organs. So the pituitary now is not receiving lots of estrogen and progesterone, but it is still making growth hormone, and it's making large quantities, releasing large quantities of prolactin. And prolactin is the hormone responsible for making milk. Matter of fact, that's what the word means, lact means lactation, so in favor of lactation or promoting lactation, so prolactin makes milk. So those hormones have a positive effect on the mammary gland, causing the mammary gland to start producing milk. And the other important thing that happens if the offspring are born alive is that suckling takes place. So suckling means that the offspring in megatherian mammals and eutherian mammals are attaching to the mammary gland and withdrawing milk from it. And that has a positive feedback on the pituitary gland. So you get in a positive feedback loop here where milk is being made. As milk is being withdrawn, that causes more milk to be made, and so on. So it's self-reinforcing. If the offspring are not born alive, then there's no suckling, there's no positive stimulation on the pituitary, and so that causes the levels of prolactin and growth hormone to drop fairly rapidly, and milk is not produced. And this creates a really well-tuned mechanism for ensuring that there's enough milk as the offspring grows, or for the number of offspring. So if there are lots of offspring, there's going to be lots of milk that's withdrawn from the mammary gland, and that increases the positive feedback on the pituitary, causing more milk to be made. So that just keeps that positive feedback loop going. If there are fewer offspring, there's less stimulation on the mammary gland, so less positive feedback to the pituitary, and less milk is made. Same thing as the offspring age. When they're little and they're not withdrawing a whole bunch of milk, there's enough milk made to support that suckling, but not huge quantities more than they can drink. But as they grow and they drink more, that increased stimulation of suckling causes increased production of milk that matches the demand pretty well. And as they start taking in solid food and their need for milk decreases, they suckle less, the amount of milk produced decreases as well. So it's a very fine-tuned loop that ensures that the amount of milk produced is appropriate for the size of the developing offspring and the numbers of developing offspring. Back to our outline. All right, so what is in milk? Lots of different stuff is in milk. It's a pretty totally self-contained food source. So there's fat in milk, which varies from species to species. Human milk is very much like cow's milk in the amount of fat. It's about 4% fat. There's also some protein and lots of carbohydrates. The main carbohydrate is something called lactose, and you may be familiar with that from even going to the grocery store, because there are a lot of people who are lactose intolerant. As it turns out, there's a very interesting line of research into lactose intolerance and the lack of lactose intolerance. And it turns out if you look across mammals, lactose is the carbohydrate. It's broken down by an enzyme called lactase. And lactase is only produced in young individual mammals. So it's produced during the time when mammals are dependent on mother's milk, and as they get older and as they're weaned and move to solid food, they no longer make lactase. So that means that across the board, mammals, when they're out of infancy, are lactose intolerant. They're unable to digest the carbohydrate lactose when they are in adulthood. So the fact that some humans can drink milk and digest lactose into adulthood is a mutation. It's something that's evolutionarily novel, and as a matter of fact, it only sprung up fairly recently in human evolution. So looking at the genetics of it and looking at the sequences of the genes, researchers have identified several different mutations that allow lactase to be produced into adulthood. And these enzymes, or these genetic variants, have co-evolved with farming and the raising of cattle for meat and for milk in various human societies. So it's evolved independently a couple of different times, at least once in Africa and once in Europe, at the same time as the human populations there were domesticating cattle and making use of milk from the cattle as a food source. So it's a very interesting line of research. All right, so finally we have a component of milk that's called colostrum, and this is actually mostly white blood cells and antibodies that are produced by the mother that help protect the offspring from pathogens, bacteria, and so on that it may encounter very early in life. The vertebrate immune system is something that develops over time. So very early on, there are some components of the immune system that are functional, but most components of the immune system, or a lot of components of the immune system, change over time and develop in response to things that that organism encounters during its lifetime. So newborn mammals are very vulnerable to infection because they don't have a functioning immune system, and they cope with that by borrowing components of their mother's immune system that are transferred through the milk. So those first early days of milk, the first day or two, typically are mostly colostrum, mostly antibodies, and serve to protect the infant from pathogens and other things that don't belong in it that may harm it. And the milk transitions over into being completely nutritional over the first few days of lactation. So if you're interested in reading more about the evolution of lactation, evolution of lactose tolerance in humans, there's a really nice overview here on this website. You can follow the link and read more about it. All right, so we have talked a lot about, oops, looks like I'm running out of time in this video. It's going to cut off after 15 minutes. So I'm going to end this video and then start up again in the next part of it. So, bye.